Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI Radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. Today's guest is James Engell. James Engell is a member of the environmental grassroots organization called Montanans for Wildlife and Wilderness. They advocate for wildlife by preserving wilderness in the Gallatin Range and the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, with a focus on the highlight Porcupine Buffalo Horn Wilderness Study area. Jim was a professor of literature at Harvard University for 45 years, where he integrated environmental issues into his courses. He is co-author and edited the book Environment, an interdisciplinary anthology that was used as a standard textbook for 15 years. He is the editor or author of 12 books and numerous articles over decades concerning the subject of environmental literature, as well as many other issues. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks very much, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here and to join these conversations.
Would you tell us something about the goals of your environmental community and about some of the means you use to achieve them?
Sure. Actually, Glenn, you stated our primary goal very well. We are concerned about preserving wilderness and wilderness areas, particularly in the Gallatin Range, which is just north and northwest of Yellowstone National Park. This is an area that is under a lot of pressures. It's under pressure from development. It's under pressure from increasing recreation, a lot of which is motorized. It's under pressure from climate change. So we hope to be able to preserve this area as wilderness because it's part of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, and a very important part. It provides corridors for wildlife migration. It provides overwintering refuge areas for wildlife. And it helps preserve the biodiversity of wildlife in the area. So our goal is to try to preserve wilderness because it is important for wildlife, but also for people. People often go into wilderness either for short or longer periods of time to refresh themselves, to get away from motors and machines, to get away from noise and light pollution, and to be as close in contact with the natural world as they can be for a period of time. So the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem itself is suffering a lot of the pressures I mentioned that are being felt by the Porcupine, Buffalo Horn, and Hyalite area, which is just northwest of the park. This whole ecosystem doesn't recognize state borders. It doesn't recognize county borders, and in many respects it doesn't differentiate public from private lands. It's a natural ecosystem, and it is in many ways still remarkably intact. And our group, Montanans for Wildlife and Wilderness, want to keep it that way. It is one of the most astonishing ecosystems in the lower 48. In many respects, it's unique because it still has all of the fauna, all of the animal life that existed in 1491, in the pre-Columbian period. It has Canadian lynx, it has wolverines, it has elk, moose, mountain lions, and it has an extraordinary number of birds as well, and smaller animals. But it's under a great deal of pressure from development, from climate, from the desire to recreate in a way that can disturb wildlife, especially by building more trails and more roads and driving more vehicles of various types through them. Not just things like, say, mountain bikes, but the new kinds of motorized snowmobiles that essentially can bushwhack through territory and don't need trails themselves. But we feel it's important to preserve this area. Just west of it, across the Gallatin River, is the Big Sky area, which has been developed quite heavily since the 1970s and is continuing to be developed. And there was a compromise made decades ago with land swaps included that essentially said, well, to the west of the Gallatin River around the Big Sky area, that can be developed. And it certainly has been. Lots of homes, lots of condos, the Yellowstone Club, the Big Sky ski area, and so forth. And there continues to be a lot of construction there. But the idea was that on the east side of the Gallatin River, in the Hyalite, Porcupine, Buffalo Horn area, which people can look at on a map if they go to our website, that area would remain a wilderness study area. And I'll just explain briefly what a wilderness study area is versus, say, what is called legally wilderness. Wilderness study area is land that is set aside that is considered to be eligible for making legal wilderness according to the 1964 Wilderness Act. And there are a number of wilderness study areas in the United States. There are, I think, 14 in Montana, 7 that are run by the Forest Service, and 7 that are run by the Bureau of Land Management. And the idea in the late 1970s in creating a lot of these wilderness study areas was that over time it would be decided whether they would become legal wilderness or not. And those decisions have essentially been postponed over decades. But as they've been postponed, it has become evident to a lot of people that those areas should be wilderness, and that if they are wilderness study areas, they should at least be protected as being possibly made into legal wilderness and not have encroachments on them. And those encroachments would mean more trail building, more use of motorized and mechanized transportation, the possibility of logging, the possibility of what is called forest management or vegetation treatments and so forth. So we feel this is an important place to try to draw the line in the Gallatin Front Range. If people want to see a good map of this, they can go to our website. We have a website for Montanans for Wildlife and Wilderness, and that website is MT and then the number 4 www.org. That's mt4www.org. And that will give people a good example of what our group stands for and what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Jim, for that clear and comprehensive introduction. So much of what passes as outdoor recreation is becoming a problem because it misses the deeper meaning or purpose of a wilderness experience. What is a true or real wilderness experience in your view?
Well, in my view, I think it goes back to the Wilderness Act of 1964 in the United States, which had a lot of thought behind it for decades before that, going all the way back at least to the 1930s or even the early 20th century. And you can say, in fact, to some degree, it goes all the way back to the founding of something like Yellowstone National Park in the late 19th century. It is to get away from, as much as possible, what man has created in any permanent way. So in other words, wilderness is not to have any permanent structures on it except where they seem necessary for emergency uses. It's not to have any mechanized form of vehicles, and that would include bicycles. Now, mountain bikes are a more recent phenomenon, but they are mechanized. They're bicycles, so it isn't just motorized, it's mechanized. It's not really supposed to have airstrips or air traffic unless an airstrip is deemed necessary by the Forest Service or the BLM, for example, for some kind of emergency operations. So there might be a place in the wilderness where you could conceivably land a helicopter or an airplane, but in general, they're not supposed to be there. Drones aren't supposed to be there. Snowmobiles aren't supposed to be there. And a wilderness experience is where one can be closely in touch with the natural world without the interference or the intrusion of man-made mechanization, motorization. Mm-hmm. Can you ride a horse in the wilderness? Yes, you can. You can ride a horse in it, and that's very often done. People hike in it. People camp in it. There are opportunities for being quiet, for enjoying solitude of a profound kind, which can encourage meditation and reflection. And it can encourage thoughtfulness about the human relationship to the larger natural world on which we depend. And of course, one can say, well, we don't really depend on wilderness because we don't grow any crops in wilderness, or we don't cut down a lot of trees in wilderness. And I would say, well, you have to consider mental health, and you also have to consider the fact that wilderness provides a place and a refuge for an incredible diversity of wildlife. And we do, in the end, depend on that wildlife in many respects, because diversity is, biodiversity is sort of, if you imagine like you're looking at a brick wall, and every brick is a species. And then you say, well, we're going to remove one species, and you pull that brick out of the wall. Okay, well, the wall's not going to fall down. That's true. But then you pull out another brick, and then a third, and a fourth, and so on. And eventually, part of that wall is going to become really shaky. And then you pull out, say, maybe what is called a keystone species, or you pull out an apex predator, and a whole section of the wall falls down. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then you are dealing with problems that are very, very difficult to manage. I mean, in Yellowstone National Park itself, we have this instance of where lake trout somehow, we don't know exactly how, found their way into Yellowstone Lake, which is a big lake, one of the highest freshwater lakes in the world. And the lake trout are very hungry, and they grow to be very large, and they started eating and decimating the native cutthroat trout. And so it's possible to, possible to change an entire ecosystem very quickly. Right. And that wilderness experience, I think, helps people understand the value of that kind of biodiversity. And that, furthermore, when the wilderness is gone, and we know this historically, it's gone forever. You're not going to get it back. You're not going to find areas in this country where people are all of a sudden going to say, look, we have to tear down all these houses, we have to move all these farms, we have to get rid of all these roads, and we're going to create new wilderness. That's not happening, and politically, I can't imagine that it will happen. So the wilderness that we have currently and the wilderness study areas we have, that's it. There's not going to be any additions to them, at least I doubt there will be. And the largest areas of wilderness, as one might imagine, are in Alaska. But the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is one that is incredibly important for the lower 48. And I think experience in it is something that is thrilling. I mean, whether in Montana you go into the Bob Marshall Wilderness Area or the Lee Metcalf Wilderness Area, which is part of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, it's something very special. I mean, you get a special feeling when you walk in, at least I do.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And here's my next question. There is a lot of talk within the environmental community at present about the need to triangulate science, ethics, and policy, which fits very well your focus on the need for an interdisciplinary approach. Because of your focus on environmental ethic, it seems to me that you want to also bring aesthetics into the discussion. Would you say something about the role of aesthetics in addressing the sixth extinction?
Yes, Glenn. Aesthetics is a term that has its roots in language with the whole idea of perception, of perceiving something, and therefore also of understanding it, but not just of understanding it, of feeling a deep appreciation for what is being perceived and how what is being perceived is put together. The whole idea of beauty itself very often includes an idea of harmony or of a kind of coexistence. That doesn't mean it's static. It can change over time. It can be organic in its changes, just as nature itself is constantly changing. But that sense of aesthetics can be allied with a sense of ethics, too. In other words, if you look at a writer like Aldo Leopold, who talked about the land ethic, you want to try to preserve the integrity and the health of creatures that together constitute a community, a biotic community, an ecosystem. And you do what you can, and because human beings now control, in essence, every ecosystem on the planet. And you can say, oh, no, we don't. But we do. We're melting the ice in the Arctic. We're changing the Antarctic. We are altering ocean currents. There are radioactive nucleotides from our atomic testing that are found in the deepest trenches of the ocean. If we start sea mining in earnest, we'll be changing the ecology of areas of the seafloor. Human beings, by exerting so much control over the world's ecosystems, also take on a responsibility for what that control means. And it certainly should not mean simply going in and taking what we want and then getting out, because we have learned that that kind of exploitation, which is based on short-term thinking, is a bad idea because it comes back to bite you. In other words, if you use the wrong kind of farming practices, pretty soon your soil will be poor or it will be blown away. So you need to develop modes of stewardship. As it were, you need to learn how to garden the earth in a way that preserves its ability to support human beings. And that's an ethic. That's a respect for things. It doesn't mean that you can't get things out of nature. Of course, you have to. We survive off of nature. But it means we do it in a long-term way. Mm-hmm. We do it thinking about our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and even beyond. Because, I mean, right now, we got 8.5 billion people on the planet. When I was a boy, I think we barely had 2. So we have 4 times as many people in just 60, 70 years. And that puts enormous pressure on the planet. And currently it's estimated that right now we are using more of the Earth's natural resources each year than the Earth can replace. Well, that can't go on forever. We're already seeing fish stocks collapse in some areas. We're seeing it become more and more difficult in some areas to raise crops because of climate change. The Green Revolution did a lot to increase food supply in much of the world, not everywhere. It didn't have a great impact in Africa, for example. But we cannot count on continued revolutions of that kind. In other words, to put it in short terms, technology alone is not going to solve this problem for us. It's going to require a deeper ethical appreciation, and that ethical appreciation certainly has an aesthetic side, a side in which you understand that the harmonized working of parts together, including the human management of nature, can itself be a beautiful thing. That is to say, certain kinds of farming that preserve the land for generations, that's a beautiful thing. People who hunt especially if they're going to eat what they hunt, that's a beautiful thing because in many respects, culling certain animal populations is necessary for the proper management of an ecosystem, and human beings are part of that. So it's a matter of integration and imagination. Now, you mentioned policy. Of course, policy's got to come in because the government has a role, whether it's a local government, say a county or a town, with its zoning, for example, or regulations about fences or water rights or whatever. Of course, it's got to involve policy, and it has to involve science.
Okay.
Because science gives us data.
Okay. I have a...
Science. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, because I have... I'm going to get into all that as we go along here.
Okay.
So what exactly is environmental literature?
That's a good question. I think it's any literature that treats the human relationship with the natural world.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And you can say that's a very broad definition, and I would say, yes, it is. Mm-hmm. Fair enough. But it's a huge topic. So, yes. For example, you could say, well, is Moby Dick environmental literature, the story of Captain Ahab and the white whale? And I would say, well, yes, you can view that as environmental literature, particularly parts of it. You can certainly view as environmental literature. Just read the chapter about the killing of whales and how they're treated, the dead whale, once it gets on board. And I mean, that's a remarkable part of environmental literature, just to think of something like Moby Dick. Or you could say, what about a diary that someone kept during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s? Yes. A personal diary. And I read some of these. Some of them they're just remarkable. Some of them are very sad and shocking.
Does every great work of literature tell us something important about the relationship between human beings and the natural world?
That's a hard question to answer. I can think of some works of literature, what I would call great works of literature, that one could argue don't do that. Mm-hmm. For example, does Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet tell us a great deal about the human relationship to nature? Well, if you look at some of the imagery in the play, yes, perhaps, but it's not a theme really of that play at all. It's not an important. It's not an important thematic element. So there, I would have to say, and there are other examples too. But then you could say, what about a great work of literature like Milton's Paradise Lost? Mm-hmm. Does that tell you something about the relationship to nature? And you stop and think, well, maybe it does, because Adam and Eve are in a garden, and they are tending that garden. and they're doing it for their own benefit. And then trouble sort of begins when they decide to go off and do it separately, and they separate themselves and are no longer a pair. So I think it all depends on the work of literature, Glenn. It really does. I would not want to make the claim that every great work of literature has something important to say about the human relationship to the environment. And that's, in fact, why there is a category called environmental literature, because it's a subset of literature, and not all literature, and I think not even all great literature says something about that. But there is a lot of remarkably fine literature that one at first wouldn't imagine has an environmental component, that in the end you discover, well, it actually does. I mean, Paradise Lost would be an example, or you might have a novel, say, about the American experience. James Fenimore Cooper might be something like that, or other novels that talk about the human experience in the West. There's a novel that is quite extraordinary. I think it's called Butcher's Crossing, I think, and it's written by John Williams, and it's about a young man who goes out to hunt bison, and that's environmental literature. So it takes a little bit of imagination and searching to think about where one can go, but the more you look, the more you find it's extremely important, and I would say it's highly important in American literature because of the way in which human beings have populated what has become the United States. Whether you are looking at indigenous populations, whether you're looking at European settlement, whether you're looking at often the conflict between indigenous populations and settlers, whether you're looking at farming and agriculture, whether you're looking at, say, fights over water rights or fights over land. So environmental literature is a wonderfully large category, very flexible, but also extremely important.
Okay, that's helpful. So I want to come back later in the interview to the topic of environmental literature, and I have a number of questions on it. But let's shift gears for the moment. So here's the next question. Is there value or benefit to dialoguing with federal and state land management issues, since we know that they are under regulatory capture by corporate business interests?
Well, of course there's value. There's always room, I would hope, for dialogue and for discussion. There's a room for public comment. There's room for engagement. And there's room for voting. Votes do matter, and people can change things by voting. Because although one might imagine that regulations are controlled by corporations, I don't think that they always are. Do corporations have a significant impact on many regulations? Yes, they do. Sometimes corporations are glad to have regulations because it provides them with a known playing field. They don't like regulations to be changed all the time, for example. Now, maybe they'll favor some regulations over others. That's certainly true. And if they have regulations that they don't like, they may try to change them. But they don't want a constantly shifting ground, because that way they can't really plan their own business. They can't have a clear vision of, say, what the next 3 to 4 years are going to be like. So they don't want a whole lot of turning in regulations. Mm-hmm. So we now live in what some people call a regulatory state, and it is true that a lot of agencies of the federal government, and there are several dozen of them at least, that have significant regulations. it's very important for people who are involved in activities that are affected by those regulations that they get to know them. I mean, one simple example would be the Environmental Protection Agency. And you could take the example there of, should they be regulating these forever chemicals, these PFAS chemicals? And if their regulation does not impose a strict enough limit on PFAS, what can people do about it? What should they do about it? So this is a very complicated aspect of what you mentioned earlier, which is policy.
Yes.
But science is important in it. Regulations should be informed by science, not by ideology. And they should not, in my view, follow the current political wind, whatever it is. They should follow science. They should follow informed science. Now, people can say, oh, now, wait a minute, science is prejudiced, science is self-interested. And I would say, no, not at its best. It isn't. Science is a communal search for truth and for facts. And as such, it does evolve and it does change. A scientist is going to have a different view about the structure of the atom in 1920 as a scientist will in 2020. And a scientist will have a different view about human nutrition in 1980 than a scientist will in 2030. But you have to hope, and in almost all cases it turns out to be the case, that over time the view that science has becomes more accurate. It improves. Why? Because it isn't just the work of one person, it's the work of dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of individuals looking at the same issue and refining it and testing it and retesting it. So I wouldn't want environmental or any other form of regulations to go through a sudden shift every time we have, say, a new president of the United States. I don't think that makes any sense. You want a certain continuity, and you want regulation to be informed by fact. Now, that doesn't mean corporations shouldn't have a say. They're being regulated. They know their own business. Of course they should contribute to the conversation. I don't think that, however, they should be able to write their own regulations.
Okay.
That is generally, no one should be able to write their own regulations. There's an old saying in law that no person should be judge in that person's own case. Well, no, you shouldn't be. And I think the corollary to that would be that no group should be able to write their own regulations. No environmental group can write their own regulations. It's part of a discussion, and it involves elected officials, it involves private landowners, it involves businesses. And as a result, sometimes compromises need to be made. One of the things that my group is concerned about, though, is that if you make compromise after compromise concerning wilderness, then you're whittling down a stick, and eventually the stick can break. In other words, wilderness is a limited thing. It's like that old proverb, they're not making any more land. No, they aren't. And they're not making any more wilderness either. So I think at a certain point one can say, there have been compromises, a number of them, and now we're going to try to hold the line on the idea of preserving certain areas as wilderness.
Okay. Well, I'm going to get more into that as well.
Okay.
So, and I understand these questions are big and complicated. I appreciate your addressing them. I'm not really looking for answers so much as just some comments. So here's the next one. Are property rights too strong in America in the sense that they often block the attainment of the common good for both humans and non-humans?
Glenn, I think that's something you have to take on a case-by-case basis. I honestly do. And that's why American law is really such a wonderful thing. I mean, however complicated and however slow our legal system may seem, it is a marvelous thing. Mm-hmm. And it would be a terrible thing if we tried to speed it up enormously, or it would be a terrible thing if we tried to say, well, it's all political. No, it's not all political. I mean, ever since before the founding of the country, America was highly populated with lawyers. The British government looked at America and said, well, you know, one of the problems of going to war with them is that they got a bunch of lawyers and they're going to argue everything. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what happened. But it's part of the beauty of the country. So I would say, if you're talking about property rights, you have to look at individual cases.
Okay, I'll take that.
And that,
all right.
And that in some instances that means someone who has private property and thinks they have certain rights to it, they're going to discover that they actually don't have those rights. Mm-hmm. And now, the wonderful thing about the legal system is then they can appeal that decision. And if they lose again, they can appeal again. Mm-hmm. And if they lose again, they can appeal again all the way up to the Supreme Court if the court decides to hear their appeal. So that's the way the process works. It's contentious. It can get messy. It can be expensive. But I think property rights are to be tested in the courts when it comes to arguments over them.
Okay, and, well, let me follow that. Yep. I have the gist of your point here. So let me follow it with just along the same lines here. What do we do about the private inholdings within designated wilderness areas?
Well, that is an issue, isn't it? And, you know, so much of the West was checkerboarded in part because of the railroads and because of other kinds of land deals. And we have all of these arguments now about corner crossings and the like. And we have land swaps. And recently the state of Montana, the land board, I think, decided that, well, if you couldn't legally corner cross from one part of public land to another, then you had to devalue that public land. Well, I don't quite understand that, because once you swap that land and a private landholder gets it, the land will immediately increase in value again because it'll all be part of private land. So I think that there can be solutions, but they need to be equitable. I mentioned earlier the creation of Big Sky, and then the concomitant creation of the Highlight Porcupine Buffalo Horn Wilderness Study Area. All that was done by land swaps and compromises and by getting rid of certain inholdings in order to exchange them. Something a bit similar has happened in the Crazy Mountains recently in Montana, not to everyone's happiness. I think the public needs to be vigilant about this because whether you have instances of private holdings that are in or near wilderness, or you have instances of public holdings that are checkerboarded inside private holdings, then all of this becomes a matter of public policy. And it becomes a matter of law, too. I think there was a court decision in Wyoming not too long ago that said you could corner cross from one plot of public land to another plot of public land. I mean, it's one of these nice questions, is like, how many angels sit on the head of a pin? I mean, how can you corner cross without actually putting your body over someone else's property? And do they have air rights and so forth? But this is something that let me put it this way: where solutions really fall down is if they happen too quickly, with too much influence of too much big money and not enough public knowledge.
Okay, all right. Well, let me continue here, because I've still got 45 questions here, and we've got 13 minutes. But anyhow,
well, we can take a little longer.
Okay, that's great. I appreciate that. So I don't know the details about the environmental struggle to save the Gallatin Range, but probably the surrounding human community is divided about what to do. So, do you and your group support collaboration efforts? Now, before you answer, let me explain what I mean by collaboration. I use the term in the specific sense to mean a process by which conservation groups negotiate with resource extraction interests to reach a consensus on public lands management.
Well, it all depends on the situation. So, for example, I don't think that there should be mining or logging done in wilderness study areas. I just don't think that's a good idea. Mm-hmm. And if someone says, well, you need to compromise on that, I would say, I think that's a bad idea. Now, that's in a wilderness study area or in wilderness. On the other hand, if someone said, here's an area of public land, it's run by the BLM, and people want to mine molybdenum on it, or titanium, or a rare earth, and there are indications that that mineral or element exists here, and that the nation needs it. And I would say, okay, well, now we need to enter into a conversation about how that might be done. Would it have to be done? I don't know. You'd have to do an environmental impact review. You'd have to see what various stakeholders had to say. But would a compromise perhaps in the end be the best thing there? Yes, it might be. In other words, you can't set aside all public lands and say for all of them, hands off. Mm-hmm. You can't say, look, you can't do any oil, you can't do any gas, you can't build any wind farms, you can't do anything with them. They're all just for conservation. They just have to sit there. And I would say, no, that's not a very good idea at mm-hmm. all. They're there for public use. Now, on the other hand, recently we've had this argument about whether some public lands can be set aside for their conservation value. In other words, can the federal government say, look, if you want to lease this land, not for, say, drilling for natural gas, but if you want to lease it for conservation use and you can show that there's an important conservation use for that, say the preservation of some species or the preservation of a migration route for, elk or deer, can you do that? And there's an argument over that. Some people say conservation is not a legitimate use for public land in that respect. I would say, well, I hope at certain times and locations it could be. Mm-hmm. So, again, I think in that instance there might well be a compromise. What I hope doesn't happen is that deals are made in dark back rooms, and then all of a sudden the public is presented with something that they either never heard about or had very short notice of. If they're public lands, the public needs to be involved in an informed way in the decisions about them. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean it's going to end up being a pure plebiscite and people will go and vote on it as such. But it means they're going to know, and they're going to be able to contact their own elected representatives, whether it's in the county or the state or the federal government, and they're going to be able to voice their opinion on what they think about a certain particular issue.
Okay. Well, I have two questions on what you just said. Let me put the first one to you. One of my interviewers, or one of the people I interviewed, I won't mention his name just in case I don't have his exact words in front of me, but the idea, what he said, was that anyone who has an economic interest regarding public lands should not be part of the democratic decision-making process that determines what happens to these lands. In other words, he suggested that stakeholders, what are called stakeholders, have a conflict of interest. What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't want to myself make such a blanket pronouncement. There's a difference. I mean, stakeholders are groups that have an interest, though maybe not an economic interest. That's the real meaning of the word stakeholder.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A shareholder or a stockholder is someone who has a direct economic interest in it. So I would say that first of all, you could say, how are these decisions being made anyway? Mm-hmm. And usually these decisions are being made at the level of regulation, but not always. Sometimes it's a county commission that takes the vote. Sometimes it's a state land board that takes a vote, or a water rights board that takes a vote, and so forth. Now, should they listen to everybody? Yes. But does that mean that people who have an economic interest shouldn't be listened to? No. Of course they should be listened to. Should they be able to make the decision directly? No. They shouldn't be able to make the decision directly. But should they be part of the conversation? Of course they should be part of the conversation. But if we're talking about economic interests in essence controlling the decisions, mm-hmm. No, that's why the people of Montana revolted against the Copper Kings. Mm-hmm. That's why the people in Montana got fed up with the powerful mining interests and launched reforms to pry them out of that controlling ability. But mm-hmm. you know, should people who want to open a mine have a voice mm-hmm. in contributing to the decision about the opening a mine? Sure they should. But should they be able to have so much influence that essentially what they want always gets done? No.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for that response. So the second question I had on this same topic is, with regard to wilderness, do you think a no-compromise stance is appropriate here because there is so little wilderness that remains in America?
In general, yes. Now, could there be exceptions? I could see certain wilderness study areas in which there might be a very good argument made for permitting certain activities in them that normally wilderness legislation would exclude. But you would have to be very careful about that, because once those activities were permitted, you are not going to go back to a state of wilderness. Mm-hmm. And to some degree, for example, that has already happened in the Hyalite, Porcupine, Buffalo Horn area. There are roads in the Hyalite area. There are historical uses of snowmobiles. There mm-hmm. are mountain bikes. There are electric mountain bikes and so forth. So at a certain point, one of the reasons to hold the line is because there have been encroachments which essentially violated the law. That is to say, the Forest Service or the BLM at a certain point did not manage the wilderness study area as a wilderness study area. It permitted changes in it. And if that can happen one place, it can happen many places. Mm-hmm. And that can happen without a change in the legislation mm-hmm. itself.
Okay.
So
well,
I think it's extremely important to hold the line until there is an actual adjudication made. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, for very good reasons. I'll give you one quick example of that. Currently, Senator Daines, who's the outgoing senator in Montana, introduced a bill called the Sportsman Conservation Act, which will permit certain new activities in 3 wilderness study areas in Montana. My group doesn't think that's a good idea. We explain that on our website. So there's an effort to change the nature of those wilderness study areas, 3 of them in Montana, for a total of about, I think it's 100,000 acres or so. And I think that's not a good idea. Could there be areas in which it might be a good idea? Yes, but again, you have to look at it in a case-by-case basis. Some wilderness study areas are actually quite small, and they're there for certain reasons. Some wilderness study areas are quite large. Whenever you have any change in them, actually has to go through the U.S. Congress, the House and the Senate. And so you have to have a good reason to do something, and you have to get Congress to agree to it. So it's quite a process. It requires a lot of examination.
Okay. So the most relevant question I can think of, and perhaps the only meaningful question right now, is how do we get out of the crisis that has become suicidal for all of life on Earth? You wrote an essay on global warming subtitled, "Who is a Mentor?" Can you explain your idea of co-mentoring?
I taught for, 45, 46 years, and I learned a great deal from my colleagues in the field of literature, but I also learned a great deal from colleagues in the sciences and social sciences. I ended up teaching a number of times with an economist, and I taught a number of times with a scientist. I also had a lot of conversations with scientists, with biologists, with scientists of physics and chemistry, with atmospheric scientists as well. And I discovered that each of us, and I would certainly include myself, from our own perches usually knows only one sliver of a certain issue or problem. And that in order to understand that problem, we need to get out of our own discipline, and we need to learn the perspectives of other disciplines. That doesn't mean we're going to practice those other disciplines, but we need to inform ourselves of the results of those disciplines.
Yeah, okay.
So I think that's deeply important. You kind of have to deprovincialize yourself and say, look, I don't know enough about certain forms of biology to know how to do a proper count of wolves. So who does? And if they don't agree with each other, why don't they agree with each other? That's a big question right now, say in Wyoming and Montana and Idaho. How do you count wolves, and how do you determine how many can be hunted each year, and so forth? Well, you can't just, stick your head in and say, I have the answer, we don't want to hunt any, or we want to have open season on them. No, you have to enter the conversation by learning what other people have said. The same is true whether you're talking about climate science or biology or fisheries or anything having to do with measuring and discussing the natural world. You have to take a position which is informed from as many perspectives as you can get.
I think it's a very interesting idea, Jim, and I have at least another 3 questions on it, but let me get through some of these other ones here. Have you thought about how much of the surface of the Earth, or perhaps the lower 48 states, should be wilderness in the spirit of the 1964 Wilderness Act?
Well, I think at least as much as is declared wilderness in wilderness study areas now. I think in practical terms, I don't really think we're going to get more than that. And so I would say, let us have that. And I think certain areas of the oceans off the coasts might also be eligible for such a declaration. There are arguments over that now. For example, off the east coast, say, of Massachusetts, should there be certain areas which are off limits to fishing and the like? Well, it's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
A lot of people who make their lives fishing don't want that. That's understandable. On the other hand, those fisheries are, in some cases, have been overfished, and in other cases, climate change is altering the kind of fish that you can take out of them, and so forth. So, I think maybe a larger perspective on this is not quite so much to worry about the official designation of wilderness as to say, how much land and water will human beings need to protect in order to keep the ecosystems of the world viable?
Okay, yes.
And E.O. Wilson and other
I was
scientists...
just going to mention that. Yeah, that's...
Yeah.
You were there at Harvard. Were you there at Harvard?
Yes. Oh, yes. I have talked with him and heard him speak, and he's very persuasive on the fact that he actually had an idea at one time which he called half Earth, I believe.
Yes.
Which is that you really need to set aside half of the land and water of the earth to manage in a very careful way in order to make the earth habitable for human beings in the long term. And I think that's very important to realize that it isn't just preserving wildlife or what we would call scenery or natural beauty. This is an interdependent question. Human beings rely on nature. And if we get to the point where the natural systems are collapsing, and we are going through a sixth extinction, the number of species that are going extinct now is very high. We don't know how many, but we do know that a number are going extinct at a rate that is higher than ever before, except for maybe when an asteroid hit the Earth, or when the magnetic fields flipped and the X-rays and cosmic rays couldn't be stopped from outer space. So we're going through mass extinctions now. It's scary because at a certain point, all of a sudden you turn around and it changes ecosystems significantly. When you add to that climate change, which is occurring, I mean, no matter what one thinks of the causes of climate change, I think it's caused primarily by our burning of fossil fuels. But if you want to think it's caused by, astronomical cycles instead, okay. But it's happening. And as it is happening, it is putting stress on these systems. So there's another movement to say, it's called 30, I think it's called 30 by 30. You want to take 30% of your land area and 30% and you want to preserve it. You want to protect it, not necessarily as wilderness, but as different things, parks, wildlife refuges, areas that are off limits to extraction. Have some countries done this? Yes. A few countries have already achieved this 30% goal, not many. If you look at a map of the United States and you begin to locate all of the areas in the United States that are in some way protected from certain kinds of development, you're not going to get up to 30%, but you're not going to get a tiny fraction either. And so this notion of preservation, I think, is extremely important. When Teddy Roosevelt went to the Grand Canyon, I think it was in 1903 or so, he made a little speech there, and one of the things he said was, leave it as it is. In other words, don't touch it. Don't try to do anything to it. Well, he wasn't quite listened to because the United States later mined uranium directly on the south wall of the Grand Canyon on a mine called the Orphan Mine. So there are violations which occur and pressures that we find that uranium in part because of the nuclear arms race in the 50s and 60s. But if we can have the strength, and it does require strength and restraint, to say there's a certain amount of land and water we really need to protect, because if we don't, we're going to see a continual erosion of natural systems which will in the end harm human health and harm the ability of society to maintain itself in a healthy way. That doesn't mean no growth. It means smart growth.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I want to return to the general issue of environmental literature. You ask people to use their imagination and imagine what the Gallatin Range would look like in 50 years.
Yes.
Since you are the same age as myself, you might remember the slogan back during the late 60s, all power to the imagination. Tell us more about the importance of the imagination in helping to solve the ecological crisis.
Glenn, I think that is tremendously important. We live in a world of facts, of statistics, of economics, and all of that is inevitable. But we also need to live in a world in which we imagine what might be. Now, that doesn't mean that we can be perfectly prescient and know exactly what might be, but we can have a vision of it. We can make a good educated guess about it, and we need to do that. So in other words, if we continue certain forms of development, certain forms of extraction, certain forms of population growth, and imagine, okay, what will it look like in 50 years? And will we be happy with that? Will our grandchildren be happy with it? That's the kind of imagination that is necessary. You actually have to stop and make an effort to do that. It's not something you can do with the snap of your fingers. You actually have to assemble some facts and look at, say, the past 50 years. Well, I can remember when I was young, I went to Aspen in Colorado. And I remember it was mostly dirt roads. And I went out to the Maroon Bells, and there was virtually nobody there. And it was another dirt road and a tiny little campground. Well, you go back to Aspen now, and it's entirely different. Mm-hmm. And there are multi-million-dollar homes sitting one next to another on a ridge overlooking part of Aspen, homes in which maybe for some of them the occupants are there only 4 or 6 weeks out of the year. And you go out to the Maroon Bells and there's a big parking lot now and so forth. Well, project 50 years ahead. Do we want the natural world to become a constrained zoo? Or do we want it still to have some sense of wildness? Do we want it to be in some sense protected? I think that requires some imagination in thinking about what can be and what has been. So I was this spring, I took a trip to the Florida Everglades. And now the Everglades National Park is a marvelous area. And I took walks in it and spent a couple of days there. It's lovely. But I also realized that area of the Everglades is only about 1/3 of what the Everglades used to be. And 2/3 of what the Everglades used to be is now turned into other uses, agricultural uses primarily, but also now more building and development and housing and so forth. Well, what if Everglades National Park had not been established? And it began as a state park, actually. And then that state park became the core of a national park. Well, maybe the whole south part of Florida, all the way down to Florida Bay now, would be nothing but farms and sugarcane fields and tract housing. Well, that would be, I think, a loss. It would be a loss for wildlife. It would be a loss for recreation. It would be a loss for the people of Florida. It requires some imagination to look at the current Everglades and say, okay, what would that be like if it's like all the rest of Florida? And is that what we want? Because in the end, it's what we value. What do we value? That's a real question. It's a question of value. It's a question of ethics. And I think the history of our country shows that there are always individuals who put that question of value to us. Rachel Carson did, not just in Silent Spring, but also in her earlier books on the sea, like The Sea Around Us, in which she essentially says, if you open your eyes to the natural world, you discover things in it that you hadn't known, and then you can begin to imagine what human impacts on them might be. So the first chapter of Silent Spring is called A Fable for Tomorrow, in which she imagines a community in which basically the songbirds and the birds have disappeared. And you can say, oh, well, that can't really happen. And then you say, well, now, wait a minute. Read recent information. What has happened to the bird population in the United States in the last 50 years? What has happened to the insect population in the United States in the last 50 years? Well, has it gone way up? No, it's declined. Is that a good thing? Well, we don't like insects buzzing around our picnic table, maybe, but there's a reason for every part of every ecosystem. And if you start pulling that apart, you get eventual collapse. And that collapse is going to redound on human beings. It's going to mean, in many cases, problems with agriculture or problems with water quality. I mean, one of the reasons for wilderness is that it's a perfect water filter. It provides lots of fresh, clean water and lots of air. It also provides a huge amount of carbon storage to keep that carbon out of the atmosphere in order to lessen the effects of climate change.
Well, okay, let me give you another question so you can
please.
I think we'll further facilitate what you're saying here. It seems that with our greatest nature writers, Thoreau, Muir, Leopold, I would include Ed Abbey, Rachel Carson.
Yes. Yeah.
Much of the value and persuasive power of their work lies in the language they use to express their ideas. Does addressing today's eco-crisis require new metaphors, new ways of imagining and seeing humanity's relationship to the earth?
That's a marvelous question, and I think the answer is yes. I think every writer who has an impact, even if they are saying or expressing something about ideas that are well established, they express those ideas in a new way. So Aldo Leopold talks about a biotic community. Rachel Carson, who began her studies in college as an English major, invokes all kinds of images and metaphors in her writing. When she talks about the decline in songbirds, she uses a line from John Keats, one of John Keats's poems, a very simple line, and no birds sing. Very simple and very stark. So yes, the power of these writers is in their language as well as in their ideas. It's partly, not entirely, it's partly an evocative language, a vivid and emotional language. But that doesn't mean that their writing is simply emotion. It's not. It's a combination of feeling and knowledge. It's a combination of reasoned thought and feeling, which is actually the way that we experience nature. We experience nature at some level that is affective, AFF. It creates in us feelings, but it also makes us think. It's a combination of thought and feeling. And the language that really good writers use, and I would say, someone too like Elizabeth Colbert or Robert McFarlane, there are many writers who are able to evoke through their language a heightened awareness, a heightened perception. And it goes back to that idea of aesthetics. A simple way to put it is when you start reading them, you want to keep on reading them. That's key. And you want to keep on reading them, not just because of a summary of what they said in terms of ideas, but you want to keep on reading them because the language puts before you another kind of experience. It creates in you, whether you visualize it in your mind's eye or whether you think about your own experiences in nature, it excites you. There's something exciting about the language. And sometimes, too, there's something frustrating. I mean, some people, including myself, read certain sentences in Henry David Thoreau, and we say, oh, really? That's a little snarky. And I think at times Thoreau intended it to be a little snarky. He wanted to wake up his readers. He wanted to say, you haven't thought quite deeply enough about this, and I'm going to disturb you a little about it. I'm going to upset you and give you a different perspective. So the language of these writers can do all of those things. It can create a sense of harmony and calm. It can also create a sense of disturbance. But whatever it does, it makes you want to keep on reading.
That's a great answer. Do you think that aesthetic truth is on a par with scientific truth in terms of mobilizing people?
It can be, yes. But as many scientists who've written about this have themselves said, while metaphors and aesthetics are indispensable to science, they are not a substitute for science. And it's possible to have a false metaphor or a false imagination. So you have to integrate the two. You have to put together an idea of aesthetics with an idea of scientific fact and scientific research. Metaphors and imaginative thinking can lead to real scientific discoveries. Einstein was speaking the truth when he said a lot of his thought came from visualizing things. He had a visual imagination. And he would think about, say, trains approaching each other at the speed of light, and that kind of thing. And then he would do a thought experiment. And it would be based on a kind of aesthetic or a kind of visual experiment in his own head. And the results of that often were extremely fruitful. But that doesn't mean that all aesthetic language or all metaphoric language or all aesthetics necessarily is pointing in the right direction. It doesn't always do so. It's possible to be trapped in a certain image and love it so much that you don't see its weaknesses or its problems. But when you combine a good language with good science, then you get the best of both worlds. And really good science writers do that. For example, Rachel Carson does that. E.O. Wilson does that. There really is. Barry Lopez does that. So there's the possibility of having the best of both worlds, and that's what a lot of the really great writers do.
I think you just answered this question, but I'll ask it anyhow because maybe you have something more to say. What's the difference between imagination and fantasy?
There were a lot of writers who thought about this over many centuries, and they have all different kinds of takes on it. In general, fantasy is a kind of less ordered vision. But I say that realizing that people will say, well, no, wait, what about Lord of the Rings? That's a fantasy. And I'll say, yes, it's a fantasy, but it's an imaginative fantasy in the sense that it has a certain order to it. That pure fantasy is related to the word phantasm or phantasmagoria. And it means somehow that there's not a harmonized plan or perhaps a fully developed sense of something that is being imagined, and that there's very little conscious control over it. Now, that's certainly not true of something like Lord of the Rings. Tolkien had conscious control over it completely. But maybe a better distinction, Glenn, would be to say there is a difference between imagination and what we would call fancy. We'd say, oh, I fancy that, or that's a fanciful image, or in other words, it's a more separate and isolated kind of thing. I think it's possible to have wonderful fantasy literature, for example, but I would also call that deeply imaginative literature. It's where you get away from a sense of a larger order, and you just have as it were, wandering images, or our dreams are really a little more closer to fantasies than they are to any imaginative construct. That doesn't mean they don't call on our imagination. Of course they do. And that doesn't mean dreams aren't revelatory. They certainly can be. But they really have very little or no conscious rational control to them. And something that is imaginative has some element of that conscious rational control. That's one way to look at it, anyway. I mean, yes. This is a distinction that has troubled philosophers and religious figures for millennia, actually.
Okay, well, that's why I'm asking you about it.
Well, I don't know how well I've clarified it, other than to say
it's interesting.
A continuing conversation.
Yeah. Okay, since the 1980s, environmental ethics has become an important part of the environmental movement in America. In your efforts to protect wildlife in the Gallatin Range, have you found environmental ethics to be a significant force? In other words, have you found that arguments and appeals to the intrinsic rights and values of wildlife are effective in influencing public opinion?
Yes, I think they are, but I think they need to be articulated often more sharply and at greater length than they are. You ask most people whether they value wildlife, and almost all of them will say yes. You ask most people if they enjoy seeing wildlife, and they will say yes. But then I think you have to go a little deeper than that and say, well, what do you value in that? Do you just value your own pleasure or your own excitement at seeing them? Is it the novelty of, say, being able to catch a glimpse of a wolf, or to all of a sudden come across a field of bison, or a herd of elk up high? Or are you recognizing that these creatures and the landscape in which they live have intrinsic value and indeed intrinsic right, a right to exist, that they have what the law profession would call in some level standing? Now, currently in U.S. law, they don't have standing. There was a famous case years ago that the Supreme Court narrowly decided that you weren't going to give trees standing in court. You weren't going to give things in nature, living things or inanimate things, they weren't going to obtain legal standing. Maybe the closest we've come to it in U.S. law is the Endangered Species Act, which protects endangered species. But that doesn't actually give the species themselves, as it were, a kind of legal standing equivalent to what that term usually means. At least that's my understanding of it. So I think the question needs to be taken more deeply. Some countries, I think Ecuador is one, they have actually given nature in their constitution certain rights. Well, why do that? It's because in the end, that will help protect and enhance human rights as well, and human well-being. A country recognizes that its natural resources of all kinds are part of the health, ultimately, of that society.
Okay, I think we probably need to. I know it's a very, very big topic, so can we just leave it at that for the moment?
Yes, Glenn.
Okay, so because I still have some questions that I want to hear your answers to. So the Gallatin Range contains the Highlight Porcupine Wilderness Study Area, plus a number of roadless areas, totaling, I believe, about 250,000 acres. Now, to save all of it would be a tremendous conservation achievement. But by itself, it would not solve the biodiversity crisis. So my question is local protection enough, or do we need a plan on the global, or at least the national level, to solve the wilderness and wildlife crisis?
Simple answer, yes. We do. And, E.O. Wilson's Half Earth was one, the 30 by 30 was another. I would hope that every governmental level, whether it is municipal, county, township, state, federal, international, will continue to develop plans for the protection of biodiversity. And that was really essentially the first part of your question. It was about biodiversity. And wilderness is part of that, because wilderness is potentially a great protector of biodiversity in all kinds of ways, not just the creatures themselves, the flora and fauna, but also the air and the water and the carbon storage and so forth. But yes, we do. And that means that you're going to have a role for government. You're going to have a role for private enterprise because it's going to be affected. You're going to have a role for private property. You're going to have public input. One of the things that is heartening about conversations that I've heard recently is the huge amount of public support for public lands. And that people do not want to sell them, and they want to have access to them. And all of that is great. However, that's not enough. Having public lands and not selling them and having access to them is just a first step. It's an important first step. It's kind of the cornerstone. But then it's necessary, if you're going to preserve biodiversity, to go beyond that. You're going to have regulations. So, for example, just this morning, when I woke up, I heard on the radio that apparently Yellowstone National Park is putting in fishing restrictions on, I think it was the Firehole and the Madison River now. You're not going to be able to fish there, at least for a while, from 2 p.m. on. Why not? Well, the water's warmer than usual, and the water is lower than usual because there's been a lower snowpack this year, and there's been greater warmth and heat. So there's going to have to be an ability to react in a way that will create protections. And that has to come from a larger consciousness, a larger environmental ethic. And one of the things we've got to do, we haven't talked about this at all, but it's really important, is we've got to start teaching this more in our schools. Mm-hmm. Not as a matter of inculcation, but as a matter of exploration. We've got to get kids out into the natural world. We've got to get them to spend more time out in the natural world. They spend a lot of time on screens these days. But even if they live in a city, there are opportunities to get out into parks, to get out even into backyards with magnifying glasses, or to make terrariums, to understand the living world at some level, and to understand that it is interdependent with our human world. So, yes, again, the short and simple answer to your question here is yes, we do need that. And have we got enough of it yet, and is it well developed enough yet? No. But we need to continue that, and the way to continue it long term is to make sure that young people get introduced to this idea early on.
Okay, that makes good sense. I had a question on the importance of education, but I think you've answered that one. So, do you worry that a focus on climate warming sometimes overshadows the equally urgent task of protecting biodiversity, since a lot of biodiversity loss is driven by habitat loss, fragmentation, invasive species, hunting, overexploration, and so on?
Well, yes, it can. I mean, if you get someone talking nonstop about nothing but climate change, they are missing the fact that one of the reasons biodiversity is under so much stress has to do not only with climate change, but has to do with this. Habitat destruction is very, very high on the list. There's no question about it. One of the upsetting things recently in the Endangered Species Act was the proposition that the word harm used in the act should no longer mean something like habitat destruction. That harm should mean direct harm to the creature itself. So, for example, shooting it, or making sure that it physically could not do certain things. But habitat destruction is of great harm because it tends to be permanent, or at least long-lasting. And it's like saying you're not harming a family if you destroy half their house. Well, of course you are. That's their habitat. Or it's say you're not harming a nation if you destroy half of their agricultural land. That's their habitat. So, yes, you're right. So, again, as in so many things involving the environment, it requires a multiple perspective, different lenses. Climate is one such lens that you need. Another such lens that you need is habitat destruction. Another such lens that you need is, do you have clean air? Do you have clean water? Can creatures find enough water? So it's sort of like, it's sort of like being a photographer. You're not going to be a photographer by having only one lens in your entire life. That's going to limit you enormously. It's going to limit the way that you capture the world. You're going to need some wide-angle lenses. You're going to need a telephoto, maybe a zoom lens, maybe a huge telephoto, and maybe a macro lens. And that's the kind of thinking that we need to bring to these environmental issues, different lenses. And we can't let one lens overshadow all the others, because that way you make mistakes. You miss things that you should have caught.
Okay, let me say why I asked that question through another question. Wildlife and wilderness rarely seems to occupy center stage in our political life. Even now, during this election campaign, strong DSA candidates focus on climate change, energy, environmental justice, while wildlife and wilderness tend to receive much less attention. Why do you think this is? And what would it take to make wilderness and wildlife central public and political concerns?
That's a very good question, Glenn. Part of the answer is that candidates focus on the issues that you mentioned because they think, in practical terms, that it will help them get elected. They think the public will react more to those issues because the public has heard a great deal about them. And because, in many respects, the public is experiencing them. There are lots of members of the public now who say that they personally have experienced some effect of climate change, whether it's because of increased flooding or heat waves or encroaching rising sea levels or whatever. And so part of this is simply an appeal to the public with regard to the public's own experience. Mm-hmm. But I think when you appeal to things that are not as directly important, the appeal is important, but it's secondary. And it's not easy to speak to a group of people about wildlife and hope to get their votes unless they have a specific issue with certain wildlife at a certain location. Otherwise, it tends to start to become abstract in some kind of way. Now, it is true, lots of Americans travel to certain areas to see wildlife. Just look at the number of people who go to national and state parks.
Yeah.
And they do it in large measure to see wildlife. It's a huge tourist industry. It's of great economic value. But it doesn't rise to the top of political discussion in general. I'm not a political scientist, but I have studied the importance of environmental questions in politics. And in general, they don't elevate themselves to the top three issues. They usually don't. Mm-hmm. And candidates tend to concentrate on the top three issues, and one of those three is almost always economic. Mm-hmm. Is the economic situation of the country and of the American people or local economic conditions getting worse or better? And why is that happening if it's not getting better? So it's also somewhat discouraging to learn, and this has been verified by studies, that people who consider environmental issues to be very, very important actually vote at a somewhat lower rate than people who consider economic issues to be very important. Mm. And I find that sad and upsetting. Mm-hmm. And there are all kinds of theories about why this is the case. They say people who care a lot about the environment have become cynical because they don't see enough being done about it, so they don't think their vote's going to matter, so they don't vote as often. But it is true. It's not my hunch. It's been actually verified statistically by all kinds of surveys. So when a politician hears that, all the more reason why they might not want to appeal to certain kinds of environmental interests, because they may know that those voters won't turn out as often as voters who have other interests high on the list. Now, there are exceptions to this. Occasionally, you'll get an issue, particularly a local or a state issue, where wildlife will be deeply important, or you get enough people upset over changes in the Endangered Species Act. You get a lot of public comments that are against the idea that harm cannot mean harm to habitat. Well, of course, harm to habitat should come under the definition of harm in the Endangered Species Act. So you riled up a lot of people about that. You riled up a lot of conservation groups, and that change in the Endangered Species Act, I hope, is not going to become a long-term effective change. So there are instances in which you get enough support publicly for this. Do I think this is going to change over time? Yes, I do think it's going to change over time, because I think if we do enough in the field of education, and if people see that ultimately their economic self-interest is tied in with an environmental interest. It's not one or the other. I mean, we had this old debate in the country about whether, well, if you're supportive of environmental things or if you're, quote, a radical environmentalist, end quote, then you're against job creation. Well, that's just not true. Mm-hmm. I mean, just look at clean energy. There are more clean energy jobs created in this country than in other areas of the energy sector.
Okay, well, let me just give you a closely related question. Putting the politicians aside, we have seen large public demonstrations on issues such as climate change, war, civil rights, economic inequality, but comparatively few mass movements for wilderness and wildlife. Why is that?
I think in part because people have assumed, and I think they're beginning to realize the assumption is not always a correct one, that because we have designated wilderness areas, that's taken care of. In other words, we've done that. Mm. We have these designated wilderness areas, and therefore the United States legal system and the Congress has taken care of it. And I think people are not aware of, many people aren't even aware that we have what are called wilderness study areas. You say to them, do you know about wilderness study areas? And they kind of look at you quizzically. You say, do you know what a WSA is? And they, no, but there are quite a few wilderness study areas in the United States, and they cover quite a lot of land. And so, I mean, you can just do a quick Google search and say, you know, what percentage of wilderness in the U.S. is wilderness study areas, and it's a fair percentage. It's not like a trivial 5 or 10%. We're up to something, I forget, maybe not half, but up high. And so I think people just aren't aware of this. The wilderness study areas in this area, Montana, were created in the late 1970s. Well, we're talking close to 50 years now. And I think people have not been well enough informed about these areas, and they think that wilderness is basically taken care of.
I see. Yeah. But
the issue of wildlife is another issue.
Yeah.
And I think there is a greater awareness, because if people begin to see things like the sage grouse, or they begin to see other creatures that they care about, and of course there are these other examples in which you say, well, you know, the whole logging industry was brought down by the spotted owl. Well, that's an exaggeration by a lot. But you have the question of whether certain creatures are valued enough in their presence. And I think that there's a smaller group of people who are deeply concerned about that, who feel very strongly. And it may be people from the Audubon Society, it may be people who are part of certain animal rights groups and so forth. But I think that awareness very often tends to be focused, and it's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, but it very often tends to be focused on wildlife elsewhere in the world. Mm-hmm. So, for example, what's happening to the elephants in Africa, or what's happening to the Asian lions in India, or why are the pangolins under so much pressure, and so forth. And that is a thoroughly important and absolutely necessary concern. And a lot of Americans have that concern without perhaps having an equally intense concern over, say, the fate of certain species in the United States, the common loon as a bird, or a lot of the songbirds that we see decreasing in population, or how long are we going to have wolverines in the lower 48? There are very few places where we have them left, and so forth. Mm-hmm. Or should we bring beavers back to areas where they were once almost extirpated? Progress sometimes there is slow. I mean, people in Montana are beginning to see that bringing beavers back in certain areas is actually a very, very good thing. It actually can be a very good thing for ranching. It can be a very good thing for helping to preserve certain areas of wetland and the like. So these things take time, and they take education, and they take awareness, and a lot of that comes from learning it first to some degree in school, but then also having a more public conversation about it. That's something that Montanans for Wildlife and Wilderness is trying to do. We're trying to elevate that public concern.
In your opinion, is the defense of the living world itself a viable strategy for a new democratic politics rather than trying to base American movements on wages and taxes or other traditional political issues?
Well, I think it's part of a strategy. I don't think it can replace those other things. I don't think it will replace those other things because I think in practical terms the American electorate wouldn't want it to replace those other things. But I think they might want it to be part of that strategy because I think they might see it fitting into an overall sense of fairness and equity, and to an overall sense of long-term self-interest. That is to say, again, if you want to think about the next generations, whether or not you have children, whether or not you have grandchildren, but you want to think about what this country or what your state or your county will be like, and you want to imagine what that will be, say, in, 2090, then you will be led, I believe, to discover that wildlife habitat and wildlife, and for the country as a whole, wilderness, is an important part of the picture. I don't think we're going to change the whole basis of our politics and make it a substitute for other things. I don't think that would be practically possible, and I don't think that it would make sense. But it needs to take its place at the table, so to speak. Because if it doesn't take its place at the table, it will get shoved out. And if it gets shoved out, the table in the end will have less food on it.
Okay, in the time remaining to us, I want to return to the subject of environmental literature, because I know you have a very rich background. Do you find in the Romantic movement in Europe and to some degree in America primarily a celebration of the beauty of the natural landscapes? But do you also find in Romanticism a genuine concern for wild animals?
Yes, at some places, not always. So, for example, I think of a British Romantic poet who's not all that well known, named John Clare, C-L-A-R-E. And John Clare seemed to have a genuine and deep concern for animals for their own sake. And you do find this, or you find in, say, Dorothy Wordsworth's descriptions of the natural world and of creatures, or very often in the journals that are kept by various individuals. You find this deep concern for creatures of just for the sake of their actually being there. Now, is this the main sense of the thrust of, say, British or American Romanticism? No, I don't think it is really. And to some degree, that's unfortunate. But is there an awareness of it? And I would say yes, there is an awareness of it. That you find this in some American writing, very often in a personal kind of way. and it's very striking when you do find it. I mean, to some degree, you find it in someone like John Muir, who's not really called a romantic, but you do find it, or John Burroughs, or you find it in somebody like Leslie Marmon Silko, the Native American writer. It can be something that is very often that rises from personal experience, or Henry Beston, who wrote The Outermost House, or the poetry of Mary Oliver. So what we consider to be romantic doesn't always include this direct focus on wildlife itself, but it can. Gary Snyder would be another example. Wendell Berry. I mean, there are a lot of writers of whom this is true, and I think it's something that is refreshing to realize. We too often, I think, try to characterize romanticism with a kind of simple and short definition. It's a very varied movement, of course.
Okay. And let me ask you another question right on this issue here. How did the romantic appreciation of beautiful landscapes evolve into the modern conservation movement's concern for wildlife and ecosystems? Is there a particularly important bridge figure?
Ooh, I think that's hard to say. I mean, some of it is through certain kinds of writing, and some of it is through the visual arts. Say something like the Hudson River School, or others, or an artist like George Catlin or somebody, but I don't think that there is one single particular bridge figure who's key here. Okay. I don't. There are ones one could pick out. I mean, in my own mind, Thoreau is a very important figure. He's not exactly a romantic and not exactly an American transcendentalist either, because he has such a strong empirical and scientific side. But is the inheritance that we get from 19th century nature writers, and some of whom are called romantic, is that inheritance important to the modern environmental consciousness? And I would say the answer to that is absolutely yes. I would say that. There's no doubt about that.
Okay. Is there something about wilderness that awakens and enlarges the imagination in a way that other environments do not?
Yes, I think there is, because it creates this definite and clear contrast between human presence and the natural world that is relatively, or in many cases, completely unmediated. That is to say, you can appreciate the natural world while driving through Yellowstone Park in a car. You can appreciate the natural world from an airplane by looking down on it and discovering things about it from a bird's eye view that you never knew before or never realized before. But there is something different when you are on your feet or on horseback in the wild, very often completely out of cell phone range, with a backpack and maybe a tent. It changes your thought processes in some kind of way. It makes you aware of different things. And so, to me, that's a value which is, it may not be important for everyone. There are very few values which end up being absolutely important for everyone, but I think it's a value that's important for many people, and I think it's an experience that if some people who never had it, they would discover that it is of great value to them as well.
This next question is one I ask all my guests. Or could you answer this question in one or two sentences. Why wilderness?
Wilderness is a primal landscape. To some degree, yes, it is artificial because some wilderness areas we have created by moving out some previous human occupation. Many wilderness areas had indigenous populations previously, sometimes nomadic, sometimes more permanent. But wilderness is something that I think refreshes us and regrounds our consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There is a science.
Right.
Yep. Let me just give you a quick example.
Sure.
There's a science fiction writer named Olaf Stapledon, who's a British writer, who wrote some marvelous science fiction, Last and First Men in London, and a book about a dog called Sirius. It's just a really fine writer. And he envisions in the future humanity that will require more areas of wilderness in order to get away from the complications of their own lives and difficulties, that there's a psychological need for it. I mean, after all, Glenn, we evolved in the presence of nature over hundreds of thousands of years. Human beings have that evolutionary background, and there are so many of our instincts and hard wirings which are attuned to being in direct presence with nature. And to get back into that, I think very often awakens that kind of hard wiring in a way that is healthy and restorative.
I certainly agree with that. Why is it important for humans to encounter wild animals in wild places?
So they can stop and observe. It's a sense of wonder. So they can see, at least for that period of time, part of the web of life. And it is a web. Sometimes they will see animals that are simply standing or existing, but very often they'll see animals interacting with other animals, maybe of the same species, maybe of a different species. And that awareness it's dramatic. It forms a kind of drama. And it lets you know that you're not the only kind of creature on the stage, and that the stage, to some degree, needs to be shared.
That's a great answer.
And that the story of the play involves multiple characters.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. In your retirement years, have you moved from romantic reverence for nature to modern ecological concern for biodiversity and wilderness preservation? If so, what brought about this development within yourself?
I would say yes, to some degree that's true, although maybe it was always, that ecological concern maybe is always something I had from the time I was young. I mean, one of my earliest experiences I remember in nature was simply spending literally hours as a boy by little streams not far from my house, just looking at the streams and examining them. And I remember reading a book when I was maybe 10 or 12. I think it was called Watchers at the Pond, which was published maybe sometime around 1960. I don't know, something like that, Glenn. At any rate, I read that book, and it fascinated me. When I was in college, I ended up choosing to study literature more than other things, but I was also a member of a club, which at that time was called the Conservation Club. And what I did was go around to local high schools to speak to students about conservation, which at that time, in the early 70s, that was almost always about different forms of pollution. It was about air pollution and water pollution primarily. And that was, of course, at the time when the United States passed some of these landmark environmental pieces of legislation in a bipartisan fashion. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. So I would say to some degree, it's not so much that I moved from one thing to another. It's that they perhaps had a parallel course in my thinking from the time I was pretty young, and that I found that they could reinforce each other in a good way.
Okay. Well, we're getting to the end of my questions, I promise you, and I really appreciate you hanging in there. Do you think it is possible to stop wars on this planet if humankind does not make peace with the earth? And do most social justice movements understand this connection?
That's a deep question, Glenn. I think my answer will be inadequate, but I'll take a stab at it. A reverence for life is something that I believe is very important. It doesn't mean that things don't die in order for other things to live. They do all the time. I mean, even if you're a vegetarian, you're going to be cutting down plants and eating plants, and there will be some collateral damage and all of that as well. But I do think that there is a connection between a reverence spiritually for the natural world and a hesitation, at a minimum, a hesitation to commit violence against fellow human beings. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what war actually is. It's organized violence against other people. And this is something that anthropologically human beings are capable of. It's not a modern phenomenon. It's been going on apparently ever since human beings became human beings, hominoids. Violence has been part of the game. But have we succeeded to some degree in controlling that? Arguably, yes. I know we have nuclear weapons now, and we could pretty much so end all life on Earth in a thermonuclear war. That is true. But I hope we get through that period in which there is any possibility of that, and in which we are able to control more our tendency towards violent solutions of difficult problems. Mm-hmm. Does a reverence for life connect with that? Yes, it does. But I don't know that we can hope for a reverence for life on Earth in general to produce in us a cessation of war. I think the cessation of war must also come from a sense that war is such a terrible thing that usually the results of it end up being far worse than what would have happened had there been no war. Now, having said that, mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's true of all wars. For example, I would take World War II, when you had a monster such as Hitler, then allied with Mussolini and with the Empire of Japan, and with their clear ideas of racial superiority and world domination. Did that war need to be fought? In my view, it most certainly needed to be fought. Evil exists, and it needs to be confronted, and sometimes it needs to be confronted with violence. But I also believe that it's necessary to do whatever one can to avoid that until it becomes absolutely necessary. And to do whatever you can to avoid that, I think, is supported by a consciousness of reverence for life. But I'm not a pacifist, and I do believe at times in the necessity of war. I do believe in the idea of a just war. But I also think in many cases, far too many wars, and I'm not just talking about wars that the United States has fought or that other nations have fought, but in general, far too many wars have not been just, and they have left the world worse off for everyone involved in many cases than before the war. And you can say, well, one side was a victor and so on. Yeah, but then very often a generation or two later, the defeated turned back on the victor and there was yet another war. And so it becomes a cycle of violence. And we see that too often in the modern world. We have to find ways to try to stop it.
Certainly agree with that. Since you were a professor for 45 years, you're in a good position to answer this next question. When I grew up in America, and since we're the same age, you probably will agree with me, young people were leaving home around the age of 18, some going off to college and hearing new ideas. Do you think this is still true today, or is the mind of Americans' youth today already occupied by social media by the age of 18?
The landscape has changed, and I've seen it change in my students over time. I think many students these days are far more informed about the world and have a different and a more heightened sense of social consciousness than many students did, say, in the 1950s or 60s. That doesn't mean it's always a more accurate sense, though. The world of social media is potentially very treacherous, and it is filled with misinformation and disinformation. I have come to believe that parents should be very careful about controlling the amount of screen time and the kind of screen time and the kind of social media interactions that their children have, certainly up to the age of 13 or 14 and probably beyond that. I started to do research on this a little more than 4 years ago. I just did enough, not a great deal, just enough to prepare a talk for an alumni association as a kind of warning about what was going on. And in it, I cited various individuals like Ms. Haugen and others who worked at Facebook and elsewhere who said, look, the algorithms and the whole business model here is just to get people to stay on and on and on. And then the fact that on social media, something which is a lie, especially a sensational lie, spreads 5 to 6 times faster than the truth. It does. Because we have an appetite for the sensational, we have an appetite for the scandalous, we have an appetite for undercutting things, and perhaps Americans are particularly good at this because they always want to deflate power or deflate pretension. We're people who don't like that kind of power. But, young people don't really have enough guidance in using social media, and they don't have enough time to read difficult long texts which require attention to the sustained thought of another mind for a period of time. So I'm concerned about that. The landscape has changed. Educational patterns have changed. Students now tend, except in some instances in the sciences, they tend not to have textbooks. They just read everything online. They read a PDF or whatever. And so books are very often of less presence in the mind of young people than they once were. And it's a more visual culture as well, with many more films and movies and streaming and online things and the like. So I think it places a greater responsibility upon parents, and it places a greater responsibility upon schools as well.
Okay. So this is my last question, Jim. A very controversial one, so I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it. So I think your idea of co-mentoring is fruitful. And my question is, do you think AI can become a genuine partner in this process of expanding human understanding and imagination?
Yes, it can. It's like any powerful technology. It has positive aspects and it has negative aspects. And it's how we manage it that matters. I mean, AI is going to get better and better. That's its nature. And in some ways, it's really only in its infancy now. we have to imagine what it might be like in 20 or 30 years. And whatever it is like then, it's going to be considerably more powerful and probably considerably more influential even than it is now. But there are dangers associated with it, and people who worked with AI early on theoretically have voiced some of those dangers. AI is already developing in certain of its manifestations a kind of personality or a will of its own. AI also often does not distinguish between things that are true and things that are false, because a lot of AI, at least in common usage, simply scrapes the internet and puts together things. And very often if you ask a question and you employ AI, it will quite rightly say, this information may not be reliable. Mm-hmm. So we have a situation in which we have this powerful new tool, different companies using it, different nations vying to be the leaders in AI, and we don't know exactly where it's heading. We don't have a lot of controls and regulations on AI at all. So we need to be very vigilant about it. It needs to be kept in the forefront of public discussion, and we need to discuss it with our young people as well. We can't just unleash AI on society and on the young people or on national security without very careful consideration. It is something that requires a great deal of vigilance. Can it make things better in the world? No doubt about it. I mean, it's already improving, especially certain areas of science and social science. My son is a scientist. He works some with AI. He's told me that AI has helped cut down the time it would take him to do things enormously. In other words, things that would take him weeks or months to do, he can now do in hours or less. And it's done well. But on the other hand, AI is capable of sending out false and nefarious political messages. AI is capable of defaming people through false images and so forth. We just are going to have to be very careful in picking our way through this particular patch.
I agree with that. I want to make one comment and then give you the final word, whatever you want to say. So here's my comment. If the folks living in the Montana Valley would imagine what the Gallatin Range will look like and what it could look like in 50 years, as you suggest, then I think scientific evidence would be a lot more alive and inspiring. So I give you the final words.
Glenn, thanks a lot. I do feel that being informed by science and scientific evidence is indispensable to any planning that is made for any local, regional, national, or international efforts that involve the environment. You know, most publications in science are hard to read because they're technical papers. So it also takes certain scientists or individuals who are now often called science communicators to translate science into language that the more general public can understand and digest without falsifying that science. And so there's an enormous opportunity here for young people who are interested in science but also interested in communication and interested in social interaction to see if they can't provide that link between the results of scientific research and getting those results in a digestible form to the public. And there are certain writers who are very good at that. Elizabeth Colbert is very good about that. Robert McFarlane. There was a woman in the 19th century, Susan Fenimore Cooper, who was very good about that in getting the result of scientific observation out to a wider audience. I hope that we can do that. I think that would help. I think that would help not only the residents of the Gallatin Valley here in Montana, but I think it would help everybody worldwide. As science progresses, often it gets more specialized, and the publications it produces are even harder to read. And so all the more reason for people to be able to step up and create an ability to take the results of science and produce language or movies or online posts or programs or podcasts in which the results of science are more widespread. I also wanted to say, Glenn, thank you very much. I know this interview has gone on longer than you had planned, but I found your questions to be extraordinarily provocative and interesting, and I hope if people are listening to this interview that they listen to your questions as much as they listen to my answers, and that they try to answer your questions for themselves.
Thank you, Jim. Your last reply there, your last comments, directly answer my question very, very well. So thank you for that. And just in general, thank you for reinventing yourself as a wilderness advocate and for bringing your immense intellectual background to bear on wilderness and wildlife issues.
Thanks so much, Glenn. I hope people will take a look at what Montanans for Wildlife and Wilderness have to say on our website, and I hope that you continue your good work.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you so much. Yep.
And take care now.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversation in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then please send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org.